Imagine you are standing in your driveway, just looking at your car, and you ask a mechanic, what percentage of this car is the engine?
They would probably look at you like you're completely out of your mind.
Right, because it entirely depends on how you are measuring it. Are you measuring by the physical weight of the metal?
Or, the cost of the parts on an invoice.
Exactly. Or maybe you're measuring by the actual forward momentum it generates to get you down the road. And today, we are taking that exact same lens and pointing it at the global economy to answer a seemingly simple question. What percentage of the economy do women make up?
Which sounds like a question that should have a really clean one-word answer, like a flat percentage.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But the economy isn't just a single object you can throw on a scale. It is a massive, complex ecosystem of production, consumption, and structural support.
Which is why we brought a massive stack of data to the table for today's deep dive. We are pulling from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, census data, and these really comprehensive reports from places like McKinsey and Brookings.
There's a lot to go through.
It really is. And our mission today is to move way beyond just a single flat percentage. We are going to map out the true multidimensional economic footprint of women. And along the way, we're going to reveal exactly why standard GDP calculations are, well, essentially missing half the story.
Oh, absolutely. They miss a massive piece of it.
So whether you are an entrepreneur trying to understand your true market, an employee navigating your industry, or, someone managing the absolute logistical chaos of a household.
Which is a whole job in itself.
Right. Understanding these hidden economic levers is going to completely change how you view everyday transactions.
We really have to start by defining what we mean by the economy, though, because I think most people immediately default to the visible, formal job market.
Yeah, the people clocking in.
Right, clocking in, logging on, and generating a taxable paycheck.
Let's start exactly there, then. If we look at physical presence, like who is actually showing up to formal paid jobs, the numbers are pretty straightforward. Based on the U.S. labor statistics, women make up roughly 47 to 48% of the U.S. labor force.
Almost half.
Almost half. And globally, that number sits at about 40%. Though, obviously, that varies wildly depending on a specific country's infrastructure. But in the U.S., we are talking about near parity in terms of physical presence.
Yeah, but that is just the baseline of physical participation. It is the cleanest proxy we have for formal economic production. But presence doesn't automatically translate to recognized economic value on a spreadsheet.
Okay, let's unpack this. Wait, actually, let me rephrase that. Okay, let's unpack this because this is where the math starts to get really weird.
It does.
If women are practically half the workforce, let's call it 48%. Why is their measurable GDP output lagging so far behind? The data shows women only generate about 40 to 45% of U.S. GDP.
And roughly 37 to 40% of global GDP directly.
Yeah. I literally had to read that section of the McKinsey report twice to make sure I was understanding it right. If you're doing 48% of the work, shouldn't you be generating 48% of the measurable value?
What's fascinating here is the mechanics behind that gap. The discrepancy between workforce participation and GDP contribution really comes down to how we fundamentally price different types of human effort.
Okay.
There are three main structural factors at play here. First, you have the persistent wage gap. Across the board, women are frequently paid less for equivalent labor.
Which immediately depresses their total dollar contribution to the GDP.
Exactly. It's just simple math at that point. But the second factor is even more structurally embedded, and that's occupational distribution.
Meaning the specific fields where women are heavily concentrated, things like education, healthcare, hospitality, caregiving.
Precisely. And we have to look at how those specific fields operate financially. So let's compare a software engineer to a kindergarten teacher.
Okay, good comparison.
A software engineer writes a piece of code once, right? And the company can sell that exact same code 1 million times with almost zero additional effort.
Right, highly scalable.
Yes. That industry is what economists call highly capitalized. It scales exponentially. Now, look at the kindergarten teacher. That teacher can only teach 30 kids at a time. The work physically doesn't scale.
You can't just copy-paste a lesson to 1 million toddlers.
Exactly. Furthermore, education is what we call wage compressed. It is largely publicly funded, constrained by local tax bases, and there's basically a hard ceiling on what the market is willing to pay for it.
So the software engineer and the teacher might both be working these exhausted 50-hour weeks.
Oh, easily.
Putting in the exact same amount of human effort and time, But the GDP output looks wildly different.
Because GDP only measures the financial transaction tied to their labor. It measures the scale of the software sale, but it completely ignores the long-term societal necessity of the teacher.
Wow.
And then the third factor driving this gap is the difference between part-time and full-time work. Women are statistically much more likely to work part-time.
And not because they inherently just prefer fewer hours, right?
Right. It's because they are juggling the massive logistical load of unpaid labor, which I know we will get into shortly. But because they are working fewer formal hours, their total GDP footprint is naturally lower.
I think people forget that GDP isn't actually a judge of structural importance or even a measure of effort. It's really just a calculator.
It only counts the money that changes hands.
Yeah. Like, if you care for your own child all day, the GDP impact is zero. But if you pay your neighbor $50 to watch your kid, and your neighbor pays you $50 to watch their kid.
The exact same amount of work was done.
Exactly. The same work is done, but suddenly GDP goes up by $100.
That is the perfect illustration of why relying solely on GDP creates a totally distorted map of reality. Because women's labor is systemically priced lower, or pushed out of the formal market entirely, their economic weight on paper looks drastically smaller than their physical footprint.
So if there is this systemic gap between participation and pay, I want to know who is feeling that friction the most. Like, who is doing the heaviest lifting with the lowest return?
That leads us directly to the data on Black women in the U.S. economy.
Which is arguably the most powerful demographic engine operating right now.
Oh, without a doubt. The labor data here highlights an economic engine that is operating at incredibly high efficiency, yet receiving disproportionately low fuel.
Let's put these numbers into a narrative that actually makes sense for you listening, because the raw statistics are just intense. In February 2026, there were over 11.4 million Black women in the labor force.
That is a massive demographic block.
It's huge. That means they represent 6.7% of the entire U.S. labor force. And roughly 1 in every 5 adult women you see in the American workforce is a Black woman.
But it's their participation rate that really stands out to me.
Right. It sits at 63.7%. Which significantly outpaces the overall women's participation rate, which is about 56.9%.
So they are participating in traditional employment at a much higher rate, but they are also driving a massive surge in entrepreneurship. This isn't just about filling existing jobs, it's about actively creating new ones.
And to put this in perspective, Black women are opening businesses at a rate that completely dwarfs the national average. The Brookings report shows that Black female-owned employer businesses grew by over 71% between 2017 and 2022.
71%. That's astronomical for business growth.
It jumped from under 45,000 to over 79,000 in 2023. We're talking about tens of thousands of new businesses in just a few years.
And if you look at the broader census data, the context is staggering. There are roughly 194,000 total Black-owned employer businesses.
And they're generating, what, over $211 billion in receipts?
Yep, $211.8 billion, driving over $61 billion in payroll. When you connect this to the bigger picture, you are looking at a demographic that is generating local demand, driving payroll, and building community wealth at a highly accelerated rate.
They're essentially acting as a foundational pillar for local economies.
Exactly.
It's like they're the MVP of the economy. You know, they're playing the most minutes, they're scoring the most points in new business growth, but they are somehow still stuck on a rookie contract.
A rookie contract is a great way to put it.
Because despite all this massive output, the data shows that in 2023, Black women earned just 64.4 cents for every dollar earned by white men. And even for full-time, year-round workers, it barely bumps up to 66.5 cents.
It's a stark contrast to their output.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. How does the broader U.S. economy sustain this contradiction? Like, how can a system rely so heavily on a specific group of people for labor supply and business innovation while simultaneously offering such low compensation?
Well, it sustains it through structural extraction.
What do you mean by that?
The U.S. economy depends heavily on Black women holding together vital sectors, caregiving, service delivery, small business infrastructure. But the historical market mechanisms that dictate wages in those sectors just haven't caught up to the reality of their output.
Ah, I see.
When you systemically underpay a highly active segment of your workforce, you are essentially extracting an invisible subsidy from them. The broader economy, the corporations, the local municipalities, they are all benefiting from this high participation and business creation.
But they are failing to return that value in the form of equitable wages.
Precisely. It's a short-term gain for the system that fundamentally limits long-term overall growth.
Man, so up until now, we have really only been looking at the supply side. We're talking about people earning a paycheck, producing a service, generating a taxable dollar. But the economy is a two-sided coin.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. You have the supply and you have the demand.
And if you want to understand the true balance of power in the United States, you really have to look at consumption. Consumption is the absolute heavyweight champion of the U.S. economic engine.
Because the U.S. economy is roughly 70% consumer-driven. It relies entirely on people buying things. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the data.
The data shows that women drive or directly influence 70 to 80% of U.S. consumer purchasing decisions.
80%.
Right. That includes household spending, groceries, healthcare decisions, education-related spending, large appliances, all of it.
It's virtually everything.
But wait, I have to push back on the math here for a second. If women are only taking home 40% of the formal GDP paychecks, how can they possibly be the primary drivers of an economy that relies on spending those paychecks?
Because earning the capital is only half the equation. Directing the capital is what actually dictates market survival. You can think of women as the chief purchasing officers of the American household. Earning a dollar doesn't tell the market what to do. Spending the dollar tells the market what to do.
That makes total sense.
Right. If a household brings in $100,000 a year, regardless of who earned what percentage of it, the decisions about whether that money goes to a new truck, a specific health insurance plan, or a particular brand of groceries, those are overwhelmingly directed by women.
Which means they disproportionately control the economy from the demand side.
Exactly.
So even if the GDP calculator says women only produce 40% of the value, they are dictating where 80% of the consumer money actually flows.
And that changes the entire strategy for consumer brands and economic policy. If you are a business pitching a product, even a product traditionally marketed toward men, the ultimate veto power in the household budget often sits with the woman.
Wow.
But, that demand power is just one part of the hidden economy. The other half, the truly invisible half, is the unpaid labor.
Oh, man. Let's talk about the logistical nightmare that is unpaid labor.
It's endless.
We are talking about scheduling the pediatrician appointments, managing the mental load of grocery inventory, coordinating elder care, the cooking, the cleaning, the endless school pickups.
That everyday grind that doesn't come with a W-2.
Exactly.
Economists calculate what is known as the replacement value of that unpaid labor. They basically ask, what would it cost if we had to pay market rates for all the caregiving and household management currently being done for free?
I can't even imagine that number.
It's massive. When you add that invisible sum to the formal GDP output, women's total contribution to the economy rises to over 50% of real economic value.
Over 50%. Wait, really? We actually cross the halfway mark when we count all the work, not just the taxed work.
Yes. The unpaid portion is entirely excluded from formal GDP. Yet every credible economist acknowledges that this unpaid labor is the essential infrastructure that allows the paid economy to function at all.
So it's another form of that invisible subsidy we discussed earlier.
Exactly. Corporations essentially outsource the maintenance and reproduction of their labor force to the unpaid household sector.
That is wild to think about. Like, if an employee comes to work fed, with clean clothes, knowing their children are safe and their aging parents are managed, they can focus entirely on generating formal GDP.
Precisely. You cannot have a functioning formal workforce if there is no one managing the household. The paid economy is built directly on top of the unpaid economy.
Okay, so we've mapped out women's value in the visible workforce, the demand side, and the hidden unpaid economy.
Right.
The ultimate test of any structural foundation is a stress test.
A stress test, yes.
What happens if you pull the foundation out? In our sources, they outline the ultimate doomsday scenario. Like, what would happen if we removed women from the workforce entirely?
It is a hypothetical exercise, obviously, but it is the sharpest way to expose the hidden vulnerabilities in modern supply chains and labor markets.
Let's look at the actual numbers here. In February 2026, there were 55.7 million adult women in the labor force. If you remove them, you instantly strip out roughly one-third of the total U.S. labor force.
Just gone overnight.
Gone.
Yeah.
And the sector collapse wouldn't just be bad, it would be catastrophic. The Bureau of Labor Statistics notes that 8 in 10 healthcare workers are women.
8 in 10.
The nursing workforce alone is almost 88% female. Women make up over 77% of the entire healthcare and social assistance sector.
This raises an important question. What happens to a society when its care infrastructure evaporates overnight?
You hear economists use this sanitized language in reports, right? They call things a labor market adjustment or a mild slowdown.
Which really downplays the reality.
Completely. We are not talking about a localized recession here. This is pulling out the foundational Jenga block.
Yeah.
If 88% of nurses vanish, the healthcare system doesn't just experience a labor shortage.
No, it ceases to exist.
Right. Hospitals shut their doors, clinics break down, elder care facilities cannot operate. And without childcare or social assistance, how do the remaining men even leave their houses to go to their jobs?
They don't. And that is the domino effect that people completely miss when they look at labor in silos. The care economy is the prerequisite for all other economic activity.
That makes total sense.
If the care sectors collapse, the rest of the workforce cannot reliably show up to work. Manufacturing plants wouldn't be able to staff their floors. Global logistics and shipping would freeze because the workers are trapped at home managing the sudden vacuum of care.
And even if they could go to work, we just established that women are the chief purchasing officers. So there's a massive demand shock waiting on the other side of this, too.
Oh, absolutely.
If tens of millions of women suddenly lose their wages, household spending plummets.
The consumer-driven engine of the U.S. economy would stall completely. Business revenues would drop precipitously. Tax collections would weaken so severely that it would prevent the government from effectively intervening.
It would just be a total free fall.
Layoffs would spread rapidly through the male-dominated sectors as well, simply because the demand for their products evaporated. You wouldn't be looking at a recession. You would be looking at a depression-scale shock.
Wow.
The system is entirely too interwoven to survive that kind of extraction.
It is terrifying to look at the mechanics of it, but it proves the point perfectly. But I don't want to leave this on a doomsday note because the sources point to an incredible upside.
A massive upside, actually.
McKinsey estimates that advancing gender equality, like closing these gaps in participation, pay, and leadership, could add up to $4.3 trillion to the U.S. GDP.
Trillion, with a T.
Right. And globally, they estimate it could add $12 trillion to the economy.
I would actually push that further. I mean, it reinforces the reality that gender equality isn't merely a social metric. It is, quite literally, one of the largest untapped economic opportunities on the planet.
Yep.
When you optimize the participation and fair compensation of half your population, you unlock massive economic growth. It increases tax bases, spurs innovation, and stabilizes those fragile care infrastructures we just discussed.
What does this all mean for you? Let's bring the whole map together. The bottom line from our SACA sources today is this. Women make up roughly 48% of the U.S. workforce. They produce 40 to 45% of measurable dollar value GDP.
Good.
But they drive 70 to 80% of the consumer spending influence. And when you finally factor in the massive invisible engine of unpaid labor, they generate over 50% of the total economic value in our society.
It is a completely comprehensive footprint, recognizing it changes how we value work, how we structure economic policy, and how businesses understand who is actually keeping the lights on.
For you listening, I want you to try something today. Look around your own workplace, your household, or your business. Try to spot the invisible labor happening right in front of you.
It's everywhere once you look.
It really is. Notice who is making the seemingly small purchasing decisions, who is managing the logistical care that allows the formal work to happen seamlessly. Once you see the hidden gears of the economy turning in real time, you really can't unsee them.
It gives you a much more accurate map of how the world actually functions rather than just the version printed on a balance sheet.
It really does. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've established that unpaid household and care labor is the absolute bedrock of the global economy, acting as an invisible subsidy to everything else we do.
Right.
Yet it remains completely uncompensated by our traditional metrics. Imagine for a second if we changed the rules of the game. If unpaid labor were suddenly incorporated into formal GDP, if it were taxed, or even if it were traded like a commodity on the stock market, how would that radically shift the balance of global financial power overnight?
That is a wild thought.
if you finally put a price tag on the forward momentum of the engine, who suddenly becomes the richest demographic on Earth. Think about it. Until next time.